Tom, thank you very much. I think it's fair to say we're quite excited that you're in our newsroom.
Oh,
and a little flattered.
Oh, well, I'm very flattered to be here. Of course, I'm the natural choice of person to talk about masculinity, so I knew as soon as this event was announced, I would get the call.
Get Tom Allen.
We have to talk to Tom Allen. He's the most masculine person I've ever heard of.
We're going to come to your version of masculinity and nipples. We're going to talk about that.
Oh, was that in the book?
Oh, yes. Both of them.
Oh, yes.
We're going to talk about all that stuff.
Yes, I do mention nipples.
So I'm going to... So Tom's book, Too Much, I'm going to tell you at the end why I think you shouldn't buy it. But let's try and make the most of it while we're together, and then I'll explain to you why I come to that conclusion. But it is exactly as Mark said. It's a love story between you and your dad, and it is the most beautiful, beautiful book. And I was saying downstairs to Tom, normally, people write books about trauma. To write a book about love in its most kind of everyday way is really a very special thing. And so I'm going to start, if I might, by asking you to cast your mind back to an alleyway just round the corner from Bromley Central Library.
Ah, yes, indeed. I should point out my dad was quite different to me in lots of ways. I've been cursed with this posh voice. And my parents I've never had, they're from South London. My dad was a coach driver for Clarks of London, if you ever see them. And he grew up in Penge or Annerley Way, if you know that sort of area. You probably live in Crystal Palace. You've been to Crystal Palace for some sort of brunch occasion. I feel from looking at you all here. And so Dad was very direct, and he had expressions that I litter the book with. Things like, if I was going particularly over the top, as a flamboyant child, he would say to me things like, Tom, there's a difference between scratching your ass and tearing the skin. He was born in 1941 in the midst of the Second World War, and he did have a life that wasn't, like our world now, which is littered with kind of how are you feeling and such like. And so he was a lot more direct than that. And as I lived with my parents for a long time, I'd say things to my dad like, have you thought about installing a breakfast nook? And my dad would say things like, have you thought about getting your own fucking house? And as a teenager, I was very worried about... I was very interested in Agatha Christie. I was quite an eccentric teenager. I liked people like Noel Coward, and I liked reading Agatha Christie. And I took books out of Bromley Central Library, and on this occasion I forgot to take them back within the date. And I was very stressed and worried because I didn't want to get fined. I didn't want to get in trouble with the library or the police. I couldn't go to prison. I wouldn't survive in prison. I've since come to realise that I'd be absolutely fine. But thriving, in fact. And so much so. And so anyway, I said, Dad, I forgot to take these books back. I don't want to get fined. And my dad said, oh, it's all right. I'll drive you up to the library. You can drop them in the letterbox overnight and it's fine. So he drove me to Bromley, and there was an alleyway to cut through. And as we were walking through the alleyway, I saw ahead of us was a mannequin on the floor around the back of the shops. And as we got closer, I realised it wasn't a mannequin, it was a person, a man, lying on his back. And I thought, oh God, there's something terrible happened here. And then I realised it wasn't, he wasn't passed out or anything, he was actually being murdered. And I thought, what luck to find myself in my very own Agatha Christie mystery. And I saw that his murderer was a woman who was straddling him and was strangling him and throwing her head back in demonic laughter as she extinguished seemingly the last throes of life from him as he shuddered on the floor. And I was watching this, and then it dawned on my sort of 14-year-old self that it was, in fact, two people having sex on the floor of an alleyway. And I said to my dad, we can't go up here. Dad, we can't walk up here. We can't. And my dad was like, why? What are you worried about? I said, there's two people up there, up ahead, having sex. And my dad went, oh, don't worry about it. And continued to walk past them. And as he did so, turned to them and went, evening. And what was also sort of strange that stuck in my mind was that they had their shopping trolley next to them. And they hadn't returned. They weren't worried about returning that late, getting their money back. But on the way back, they disappeared, presumably to go and get their pound. The second. Sorry.
So I'm really glad.
You just asked one question there, and I went off on a long tangent, as all masculine people do.
Yes.
Classic masculine trait.
But perfect. The reason I wanted to ask it is because when I read the book, I was like, and that's what I wanted to know. Was it a evening or it was a full, just cheerful hello evening?
As I say, Dad was born in the Second World War, and I think anybody who grew up, he was keen to impart on me how different the world was at that time. And as you know, a lot of us will be aware, it wasn't easy for people in the middle part of the 20th century, working class people, and you didn't have time to sort of worry about feelings and being delicate about things all the time. You just had to go on with life. And my dad had learned, I think, that it was better to be direct about things than to sort of do-si-do around them. And that's something that he tried to teach me, but which, as you're probably telling from my conversational style, I've not succeeded in learning.
Well, there are a few things. We're going to come on to that, the radiators and the rest. We're going to come on to that in a moment. But you say you had a direct style. So I loved evening because I just loved the kind of like the directness of it. But I'm really intrigued. I love my dad. My dad has a capacity to communicate in ways that no one understands except me. And I'm like, no, he said that. That's not what he means.
Oh, yes.
So you've got here, which I love, one of your dad's phrases, "It's cold enough for a handbag."
Yes, nobody knew what he was talking about. But I think it must have come from, I don't know, being drunk or something. But if it was cold outside, he'd come in and go, "Oh, it's cold enough for a handbag." And I assumed it was some sort of Cockney rhyming slang thing. But it wasn't. It was just bullshit. But I suppose it was just a vernacular that he had with his mates down at the pub, and that had become part of their way of speaking to each other or something. It's just like a nonsense expression.
But it's cold enough for a handbag means it's cold, or does it mean the whole world's just gone to shit? What is it?
A bit of both, really. He would say it particularly on cold days. He'd say, "Oh, it's cold outside. Oh, it's cold enough for a handbag." But he'd also, it was like, it doesn't mean anything. It was just like, well, the world is mad and doesn't, he'd use it in different contexts. I think, James, as a journalist, you're searching for a meaning when there is fundamentally
This may be the story of my whole working life there.
There's
life.
Well, I suppose that was one of the things I found from writing the book was that a lot of the moments we shared or a lot of the experiences we had or feelings I felt didn't make any sense in the way that human beings don't really. And I always say, well, if people did make sense, I'd be out of a job. And so would you, I suppose, because we'd have nothing to talk about.
Both ways.
Nothing to...
Okay, let's get it tucked into masculinity. And by the way, the same rules apply as applied in the previous session and the next one, which is we'd love to hear from you. You know, wave at me. I'm going to make sure we get the lights up in a minute if we can, Connor, just so we can see everyone. You can either have a question or you can have a thought or you can talk about your father. You can do the whole thing. Tom's here to kind of engage with all of us. So I want to ask about radiators and water softener and your dad as a very practical person, because he comes across as a very practical person, and you seem to ascribe a certain masculinity to that practicality.
That's true. I suppose it falls into a sort of a trope that is considered or has been considered a masculine thing of sort of rather than talk about your feelings, you just do things. So my dad was very adept at mending radiators, he fitted my mum and dad's kitchen when he was about 78 years old, a kitchen they bought from Homebase and it was an ex-display kitchen, which they had not measured. But again, my dad was like, "Yeah, that's fine, just get it." As though like dwelling on considering the kitchen too much it was kind of a waste of time, was irritating, I don't know if he would see it as a feat or anything like that. It was more that it was like, "Oh, come on, let's get on with it. I want to get on to the next thing." A sense of charging through, which I suppose he had to embody himself. His own father had basically, as he put it, pissed off, which must have been very difficult for his mum in the mid-1940s. And so he didn't have a father figure in that respect. So he had no one, as he would say, he had no one to teach him to do a lot of practical things, which I guess traditionally that would have been the case. So he had to rely on himself, and I think that became part of his identity, whether that's a masculine thing or not. But he learned to become very self-sufficient, and nothing really challenged him. So he would get up on the garage roof to move the the satellite dish for the Sky Television, or he would lay paving slabs in the back garden, or he would bring in water softener tablets from when I moved into my new house. He was an electrician at one point in his life, so he would just sort of do the electrics in the house. At one point, he nearly blew himself up. There's a mark on my mum's kettle where he dropped a wire and it basically burned the kettle. But it didn't put him off, whether that's right or wrong. But he just sort of had this way of just doing things.
But throughout the book, the constancy of your dad is a kind of thing that you feel reading it.
Yes.
And it's kind of striking, that thing about his own father having kind of essentially walked out on them.
Yeah.
What I don't get is whether or not he talked about that, you talked about that, whether you really tried to kind of get the drains up on what impact that had on him and how he thought about fathering as a result.
I think for him, again, I think it's as much to do with, rather as much masculinity as it is to do with history. It was kind of unthinkable, like to dredge up feelings. I think we take sometimes for granted how we talk emotionally quite a lot now, and that's a great thing. But I think for a generation who didn't do that and couldn't do that. I mean, I think if you think about the Second World War, what happened in London, for example, and all over the world, it was horrific. But yet, if you talked about feelings too much, you just wouldn't be able to continue. So you had to bury them, which is so anathema to us now. So I suppose for him, it was he would express his frustration and his anger at his dad, but there was no way we were going to sit and talk about. How he could get closure on that.
But there's also a thing which is about, the suburban approach to kind of family and homes, and in its own way manhood versus a kind of inner city, and you're in on the joke on both sides. But I'm never entirely clear which one you prefer.
Whether it's suburbia or the sort of metropolitan version of masculinity, or just of being?
Both.
Well, I think for a long time, as a queer person, I don't know why I feel like I have to say that with like a flourish. It's disappointing otherwise, isn't it? It's a queer person, I'm just a queer. I don't want to be just a queer person. I'm a queer person. And I suppose for a long time I hated suburbia and the trappings of that, and the sort of feeling of, always feeling like you were being watched and you had to keep up with the Joneses and that kind of small town idea. And I dreamed of living in the inner city and where everything seemed so exciting and people and events where people sit in a basement drinking wine and having sausage rolls. And as a concept, talking about sausage rolls or cheese and onion, what are they?
Yes, some vegetarian sausage rolls.
Some sort of vegetarian sausage roll.
Yes.
I mean, vegetarianism, what are you talking about? And I thought I wanted that, and at one point I thought, I'll live in Elephant and Castle and be one of those, dream gays. And grow a moustache, carry a tote bag, and roll my trousers up. And then I thought, no, you know what? Actually, that's a load of old bullshit. And no offense if that is you, but no,
so Elephant and Castle. Go on.
Elephant and Castle. Or then like the Barbican. I thought, I should get a flat in the Barbican. Yeah, so arty there, brutalist architecture. Yeah, that's who I am. Flicking through my copy of Wallpaper magazine. Subscription to the New Yorker, which I'd never read, and that life, and mid-century furniture. But and I went to look at a flat in the Barbican. It was so much money, and it had a view of a car park and some bins. And again, I feel like maybe some people here live in the Barbican. I'm sure it's lovely, but to my mind, it felt like a prison, and no offence if that's your home, and it felt like a prison that was also a secondary school from the 1960s, and yet somehow you can never get out of it, you can never know where you are. And I think I realised that actually I valued, what I talk about in my book really is how, like a lot of us, I felt like I need to be away from my family and my upbringing, and I was different, and I was, had to have this superior life. And I went on this circuitous route and then got to the end of it and realised, actually, I am from suburbia, and I like that boredom, and I like that not small-mindedness, but that small-townness, and that kind of like the fact that a Saturday morning is, you might just go shops. Or you might just do the garden. And I say there's no just about it. I found it actually very fulfilling. Yeah. And I think for a long time I underestimated how those sort of traditional trappings of suburban life were, I'd assumed that they were boring, but actually I realised in our fast-paced world of constant breaking news, polarized opinions all the time, and it's all trying to keep up with everything. Actually, everybody just needs to sit down and shut up. And actually, there's great value in just going, this is enough. It's enough for today. It's enough for today. We don't need to chase all the time. We can just sit still. And I think for me, that was a big revelation. And I suppose my dad had always, for him, the suburban dream was wonderful because he grew up in one room with his mum in the top of a house in Penge. And so to have like a garden and to have, space for his 2 children was a huge achievement for him. And I think in my arrogance, my sort of millennial arrogance, I was like, oh, what a lot of bullshit. Forget it, Dad. I want to live in this car park and be gay and go out for brunch and shag everyone. And then I was like, what am I talking about? That's not really who I am at all. And that's not really who anybody is, I think, because that's a performance. And that's, maybe it is who you are. I don't know. I don't know you. But I realized that there was, where it was a sort of, it felt like an obviousness to suburbia, to the suburban dream of having space and getting on, talking to your neighbours and having time to say hello to people. That's the suburban dream, born out of the kind of the poverty that was exposed in the early 20th century and in the Second World War, I suppose. And it was sort of a journey from that, hopefully. And I came to appreciate that. And I thought it's a directness, I think, that my dad had.
There's a passing reference really early on in the book to your dad's appreciation of garden furniture.
Yes.
And all that garden furniture means. And from up in reading it, I thought, there is something that in Fathers and Sons, that the son in appreciating what the father sees, loves, sees it again. You get that feeling. Not that we're going to talk about that now, because we're going to talk about gay saunas.
Okay. James, you're obsessed.
I know. I can't get away.
We were talking about them earlier.
Phone me about them. Hang on. I'm going to come to you. I'm going to come to you 1 second. I just need to go through Tom's naked gay sauna masculinity moment, and then I'm going to come to you in a moment. There's going to be a natural follow-on, if that's all right. Tom, there's a chapter in the book where you go to the gay sauna for the first time.
Yes.
And we'll discuss the success of that visit in a moment. But the
huge success.
But the thing that you talk about at the beginning is, so you get in the gay sauna and you get undressed, and then you talk about walking in the most masculine way possible. Well, and I'd like you to explain what that is.
I think as well, in terms of like queer history, or something. But I feel like when I came out, so early 2000s, it was a very, well, as any time is, but it was, I suppose people weren't talking about AIDS as well. They weren't suffering. There wasn't the epidemic of AIDS. HIV was still around. People were still dying of AIDS, but it wasn't the big topic that it had been in the 80s and 90s. I think that's fair to say. Forgive me if I'm wrong. But there was a new sort of generation that I suppose I was some way a part of, who suddenly had access to the internet. And there was a great sense of shunning, it felt, shunning anything that wasn't sort of typically masculine. And there was a lot of references on things like, Grindr came about at that time, which actually I always found was a wonderful thing, because I grew up in suburbia thinking I literally was the only gay person to ever exist. And if you wanted to meet other gay people, you had to go to Manchester, and you had to be like Queer as Folk and say, I'm doing it, I'm really doing it, and there'd be open brickwork, and then you'd get a part of Nicholas Nickleby. So and so it seemed very strange. So Grindr came along, which suddenly you could talk to other gays, and you realised, there's a gay over there, there's a gay 150 metres away, there's a gay in the next street, and suddenly you could talk. And that was nice. But then suddenly there was this creeping sense of what could only be described to my mind as internalised homophobia, or something along those lines, whereby people were going, I'm only interested in masculine guys. I want to be with mask for mask was a phrase which was used a lot, because I guess I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine it was born out of an internalized homophobia, whereby people of my generation had grown up not liking the fact that they were gay, and so any demonstration of that felt like something they wanted to hide. And I think a lot of people were caught up in that, and I suppose I absorbed a lot of that because I saw that on the dating sites and in the gay press at times as well, like in personal columns, and it felt like I don't know if it was like in the rest of the country, but it felt in London like it wasn't a very friendly or welcoming place. Happily, I think it's changed a lot now, and I think it's evolving in a very positive way now. But I don't know if there are any queer people here who remember that mask for mask sentiment being expressed, and it was very hateful. It was very subtle as well. It would be people saying things like, if I wanted to go out with someone feminine, I'd go out with a woman. I'm a gay bloke because I'm interested in blokes. And it was very tied up with these ideas of masculinity. And I suppose within that, I mean, in the 70s, I suppose there'd been that performative masculinity of kind of, in America, wearing traffic cop leathers, which lately had become seen as totally camp, which of course it is, so performative. But at this point, it wasn't particularly, there wasn't camp, and camp wasn't celebrated, and there was this idea of, this notion of you should be masculine. It felt like that's what I felt or I experienced. And I think it played into my own internalized homophobia, because I'd grown up during Section 28 and there weren't positive gay role models at all, really. So I went to the skate sauna, and I was intrigued by these places that seemed to be darkened windows. You never saw what went on inside, and they were tucked away, but seemingly it was a place where people went to, I guess, have sex. And I was so scared of that anyway, as an idea of going to have sex with people you didn't know. But at the same time, I was intrigued. And it seemed like that alleyway on the way to the library. And so I took my Agatha Christie's, and I one day plucked up the courage to go in there. And I didn't know what I was supposed to do. But as well, you get given, people, my experience of them was actually that the place I went to, they were very friendly, really. They gave me a towel and a like a locker band, and said the change rooms do there, and then you sort of have to find your way. It's like a first day at like a new job. I mean, job being a terrible choice of word. But so it was very frightening, and I thought, well, I should try and act masculine to try and attract somebody. What a bizarre thing to do. And also, you saw on Grindr, like, people were starting to put up pictures of themselves topless, and they always seem to have like defined muscles. And I thought, oh God, I should try and pretend I've got muscles. I mean, I was out of my mind, trying to pretend that I had defined torso muscles. And so I went in there topless, but just sort of stuck out my nipples and sort of tried to look kind of strong, but in doing that, just looked really hunched and sort of like I was sort of holding my shoulders up, and just sort of walked through and then sat down in the sort of cafe area that it had, which is kind of strange when you think about, in a sort of what is a premises designed for sex, has got a tuck shop in the middle. Like it was PGL or something. And you could buy like a Club Biscuit or a Kit Kat. And they played there were television screens playing Emmerdale Farm.
No.
And it wasn't like anything I imagined. It wasn't the sort of sex. In your mind, you're like, yeah, they're so sexual and they're so sexy. Everybody's so confident. Everybody's having sex. In truth, it was like going to an old people's home. Which I would much rather have been in, I realised at that point. But there was part of me that was like, no, Tom, you've got to do this. A sense of no, I've got to be a proper grown-up gay. So I had in my mind that all these confident gays were going out and going to saunas and having sex all the time. And I was just living at home with my mum and dad watching Emmerdale. Anyway, it turned out I went to a gay sauna and did basically exactly the same thing. And they had these Chesterfield sofas, and I sat down on one of them and, of course, slid off it and made this awful sort of farting sound. And it was awful. And I tried to talk to somebody, and then I felt like my voice was wrong, because I've got this posh voice which sounds like Noel Coward doing an impersonation of Kenneth Williams. And so I tried to put on a voice, and it was awful. It was really awful. But I was just so unsure of myself. And then I did go for an exploration around the sort of maze area. They sort of designed it like a sort of Grecian. Maybe some of you have been to places like this, but if you haven't, like a sort of Grecian temple or something. And what that meant, it sort of looked like a kind of garden centre in the 1990s, like statues and fountains and those sort of green and orange lights everywhere. And then they had like this maze. Well, I said it was a maze. It was sort of like bits of plywood to separate different rooms out. And then someone had draped like a string of LED lights around the outside, which I suppose they thought made it look all the more daring, but in truth sort of made it look like a really depressing, I don't know, just like really badly designed. Like, who's designed it? No one's designed it. And there was a room with a sex swing in it, but there was no one in that room. And it was just intriguing to look around this kind of space. Again, they designed it in a really, like, industrialised style, like brushed steel and chains and things, as though that was, like, again, macho. as though that was going to be like, yeah, that's what men want, having sex, like sort of in this kind of strange, I don't know, shelving system. And I sort of looked around and the thing is, walking around in a towel after a while, you can get a bit cold. And I was tired because, you can't really rest anywhere. And so I started to walk out and this man was sort of staring at me in this like trying to be all cool way. And I slipped on some lube. And sort of went into the kind of the splits, but managed to rescue myself and try and regain my dignity whilst also grabbing my towel. And this man then started laughing. And I suppose there was a moment when we kind of like, it was kind of a slapstick routine really. But, and then I thought, well, I'm going to leave now. I'd had enough. I was tired by that point. So and then I went home frustrated, and then my dad offered to pick me up from the station. So it'd been like a couple of hours absolutely wasted. I felt even more frustrated about sort of not living up to these ideals I'd projected for myself of what a gay man should be.
And there's this absolutely lovely thing, Tom, because you have that whole journey. You slip on the lube. You have this moment where
it's the classic journey. It's a classic journey.
It's a wonderful thing. And then there's a really lovely thing I point about, like your dad just showing up. At the very end of that whole chapter, this lovely line where he comes to pick you up from the station. He says, "Everything all right?" You say, "Yeah, Dad."
Yeah, and
that's it.
Well, the nature of our relationship, I realised, wasn't like a Hallmark film where we'd say, "I love you," or I'd say like, "Dad, I want to talk to you about my feelings. I haven't really," because it would have been so. It wouldn't have been something my dad would have been able to talk about. If I'd sort of talked about, he didn't. He knew people who were gay, but he didn't realise. Like they would be flamboyant.
And he didn't
people.
See that.
And he would be like, "Oh, I didn't know they were gay." and had no idea about those sorts of things. So it would have been too.
But he must have been really proud, Tom. I mean, he must have been like, "Here."
Not on the gay sauna front, but on the
not on that particular outing.
Couldn't even use a gay sauna.
No, but on the whole kind of TV and laughter.
Yes.
He must have been.
Yeah, he was, and I think for him it was. He wanted me to go to university because he never got the chance to go. But I decided I wanted to pursue this showbiz live, and for a long time it wasn't working out. But it did, in the end, sort of seem to pay off. And so he was proud of that, I think. Yes, I know he was. But yes,
I'm just also doing a lousy job of bringing everyone in. Yes, there's someone here. Sorry.
That's not a natural segue, because I have a question about your father. And I have a confession.
I would you say your name? Sorry.
Zoe.
Zoe.
Hi, Zoe.
I have a confession. I've not read your book yet, and
Wow.
I don't know.
Is that all you wanted to say? Was that all you wanted to say?
And I don't know anything about being a son, but you mentioned your father didn't really have someone to learn from to be a father, but do you think he learned from you about masculinity? Because I know that with my own father,
That's interesting.
I'm someone who unapologetically cries a lot, and I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not embarrassed. Everyone else is embarrassed. I'm not. And my father has very often been confronted to this, and his reaction is he's a bit like, "Oh God, what do I do now?" And as I've been more obstinate in, "Yes, I'm crying. What are you going to do about it?" I've sort of felt him soften a bit, and he's not comfortable with his emotions. And he's not the most emotionally literate person, but I feel like as we've got older and as our relationship has evolved, he's sort of learning to lean into that a bit more. And so I was wondering if you felt that your father had learned something about masculinity from you, because I imagine he must have done.
Oh well, that's what a lovely thing to say, and a really great point as well. I think we forget, don't we? We see our parents as these totemic figures, these amazing gods, really, who provide everything for us, and we forget that they are emotional beings who are full of flaws. And I see friends of mine now who have children, and I think, what? What? How? But I think, the fact that they're just people, parents are just people, and I think, Dad did learn. I think he learned about. Because it wasn't like he was like considered in his masculinity. Since we're talking, that's the buzzword for tonight.
It is.
Yeah, sure. He wasn't thinking about it. He was just himself. But actually, he would surprise me, but being more emotional than I ever gave him credit for. And when I came out to him, he started crying. And I'd imagine as a teenager, like, oh God, I would never tell my dad. I'll just never tell him, and that'll be fine. I'll be too embarrassed. And then I told him when I was about 24, which is late. And he was like, "Oh, I wish." He got emotional because I'd never told him, and he was really hurt that I hadn't invited him in, and he felt that I'd gone through this time of not being able to express it. So I suppose a lot of the time we second guess people based on these labels and these kind of notions of identity. Like it means we sometimes assume, and actually that was certainly my wrong. And yeah, maybe he learned from me. I wouldn't. I guess so. Yeah, I guess he would say probably he did learn something.
Tom. Here is.
Hello.
Hi, I'm another queer.
Welcome, finally.
So I had a question. So only because I noticed it's been a year since Sin came out, Queer as Folk, is, you know, it sounds like you were quite alone in kind of your coming out. Did you have that kind of father, family, that kind of queer family around you that you learn a lot from? Because I think that's been really valuable to me, and a lot of queer people find their own adopted families and have those kind of father figures around them. Is that something that you kind of had? Because, for example, the friend to go to the gay sauna with you to kind of show you the ropes and like make sure you didn't slip in there.
And yeah,
no is the answer.
mind that lube. Yes.
So I was just, because I think that's something that's really beneficial to the queer community. We were talking about football in the last session.
Oh right, yeah.
And queer communities can have such a power in those roles, and whether or not you had that yourself.
Yes, I think I did as I came out. Yes, I did, and I did have people who were slightly older than me, and then as I've got older as well, I've made more friends. I felt like I could make more friends and relate to people on that level, because I think when I was at school, I felt like it was such a thing you had to bury. You could never talk about it. It was conditioned into me. I felt as like the most shameful thing to be queer. Section 28, I think, and homophobic bullying and a lack of role models all play into that. And so relating to other queer people it took me a long time to be able to do. And I think what I regret now is that there was a discord between the queer friends I made and my home life, because actually whenever I brought them together, it really worked. But I'd conditioned myself to think of like, no, there's this world in London where you get saunas and tote bags and moustaches, and there's Bromley, and there's family, and there's Yorkshire puddings and Emmerdale, and that's it, you know. So I think that I regret I didn't actually take those chances actually more and bring them together. But I was lucky I did have people around me when I first came out, I suppose, yeah.
What do you think? Sorry, I'm going to come to you. We was past few. Can I just one thing, yes, Tom? In the last session, it was interesting. But a gentleman at the back talked about toxic masculinity.
Oh yes.
And the curious thing is, we're here now talking about your book and talking about some of the things that were talked about in the last session. You know, men who are not communicative, men who don't have that emotional register. But we're talking about your dad in that way, and celebrating the way he communicates without necessarily being emotionally communicative. Where do you read, or how do you understand what toxic masculinity is? In response to your first point there, I think what I really have come to learn and appreciate is that actually not every expression of emotion or emotional register is linear or is expected. And for my dad, he was very emotionally literate and very expressive, communicative. But his way of showing it was to make me a bacon sandwich and to talk about something incidental, or we'd sometimes just sit in silence, or we'd sit and watch the television. And I suppose on a filmic level, that would be a character you'd be like, this man needs to go on a journey and the man to express himself. But in truth, what I come to realise is that was perfectly fine. And that human beings express themselves in all kinds of ways, and that's brilliant. And I think that diversity is important to appreciate and enjoy, and not condition people to go, well, if you're emotionally emotionally expressive and explicit, then you don't have to, it doesn't always have to be totally verbal. But there was never a period, a lot of the time in that book, your dad's telling you basically not to worry. Right? Like you're worrying, he says don't worry.
Yeah.
And were there periods in your relationship with your father where you were like, Dad, actually worrying's a good thing. It's healthy. It's normal. Blah blah blah. Did you have periods where you were really frustrated with your father and thinking he was, he just didn't get it?
I guess there were times like that. Yeah, and I think for maybe a lot of us we feel that because you're like, you see me, but you don't seem to see everything about me. You don't get that I'm stressed about this thing or why I'm worried about that thing. But I think as well, my dad sort of felt like, well, I had to go on my journey, and you can't fix everything, you can't soothe everything all the time, and me worrying about like, oh my God, what does blah blah think about me? Part of him was probably like, you're a 35-year-old man. You need to be able to deal with that. You need to be able to deal with that, I suppose.
Sir,
I was
would you say your name? Sorry.
I'm Richard. Hi.
Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Hi. I was struck by the point you made there about the fact that obviously your dad responded to you coming out to him in a sort of quite a sort of like a emotionally sort of in a way quite emotionally literate way,
For
in
sure.
the sense that sort of, he did respond to it quite emotionally. And I was struck by that in the sense that I wonder whether actually over time, as generally society has become probably more accepting of of different generally differences, but particularly obviously the queer experience and things like that. Is there actually a link, do you see, between a parallel even between actually that and society generally becoming more accepting of just different versions of masculinity? Is there a connection there between, has the sort of gay experience helped in some ways to sort of open up different ways of thinking about and less toxic, if you want to put it in those terms, less toxic ways of thinking about masculinity generally?
Yes, I suppose. To define masculinity in any way, it is quite. By its nature, is very simplistic, isn't it? Of course, it's. But I guess queer representation has probably helped kind of show other ways of existing and that they're okay. But I dare say as well that they've always been there to some extent. And I suppose in my experience, the great thing has been actually humour, because I think humour has allowed people to, across the ages, I think has always allowed people to accept one another and learn about one another and communicate with one another in a way that feels less emotionally literate perhaps, but it still allows people to relate to each other. And I think humour is a big part of that. And I think queer humour is a big part of that, in my experience. And that, because it allows people to be themselves and get their personality across in a way that, I don't know, is sort of, is just allows people to accept us, I suppose, if that makes sense. I don't know if that is making sense, but do you know what I mean? It's not. I think the queer experience has brought different perspectives, and I think fundamentally, parents love their children, so that seems to triumph in the end. I know it's sometimes different, but hopefully most of the time that happens. Rambled on there, didn't make any sense.
So we're coming towards the end, but I just want to explain to you the reason I said at the beginning why you shouldn't buy Tom's book.
It's dreadful.
It's really long and the type is
so small.
the reason is that if you read it, it's like Tom. It's like you have these just absolutely lovely stories where you're just reading and you're laughing, and you think, the books aren't normally like this. They're nowhere near as lovely or funny or warm or just human as this, and you're having an absolutely wonderful time. And then will you explain what you do in the very end of the book, Tom?
Well, my dad died very suddenly, and I was on holiday. I just got into my first relationship at the tender age of 38, and I'd moved out of home, and I was with my boyfriend, and we said we'll go on holiday, and so we went on holiday, and we were there for a day, and I got the call to say my dad had had a heart attack and died, and so I never got a chance to say goodbye. What that goodbye would be, I don't know anyway, but or to process it or anything. It was just a sudden shock, and so I decided that I would write a letter to say goodbye, I suppose, or just a letter really, just to say what I felt. And I found with the book, I think with books generally, you owe it to the reader to always be honest and to be vulnerable. Otherwise, what's the point of writing it? And because people take your book with them on holiday, and they take the book to bed with them, and it's a very intimate relationship. So I thought I owe it to the reader to be honest on that journey. And I wrote the book in quite a raw fashion, because it was in the 6 months after losing Dad, really, that I was writing it. So it was very much a raw experience, but I hope that it's cathartic to anybody reading it, as well as life-affirming, because it's as honest as I could make it.
It was, well, at least in my case, it was too cathartic. So I get to the very end, I read the letter that Tom has written his dad, and then I'm just in floods of tears. And so can I do one thing, which is probably very unfair? The letter is the letter itself is this wonderfully scattered thing. It's a bit of like how my vegetable patch is growing, and I need to get to the end of my book, and I've been procrastinating. And then there's this lovely paragraph, which I wonder whether you'd read.
Oh, gosh. You didn't prepare me for this. Oh, yes. We were different, weren't we, in lots of ways. You always accepted me, though. Our differences taught me what love is. It doesn't matter how we expect it to be, it just is. I lived with you for so long because I wanted to be around you and Mum, and that was it. I just wanted us to be together. In life, that's all any of us have, isn't it? Just each other.
Thank you. Tom Allen, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thanks for watching that video. If you enjoyed that, we think you'll love these. And if you want to join us for the next live recording of Tortoise Lates, head to tortoisemedia.com/book.